Invisible Illnesses, Stoma and Continence series, brought to you by SecuriCare. Whatever your stoma or continence care needs, SecuriCare puts you first.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of our four-part Invisible Illnesses, Stoma and Incontinence mini-series, brought to you by SecuriCare. In this series, we are looking at the meaning of an invisible illness and exploring the journeys of individuals living with a stoma and or urinary incontinence, as we're joined by several friends from SecuriCare, including specialist nurses who look after people living with a stoma and urinary incontinence, as well as Bob Smith, a gentleman living with a colostomy. To give you a bit of background, SecuriCare is a specialist healthcare provider based locally in High Wycombe, delivering NHS services all over the UK. As well as having a team of specialist stoma care nurses working in hospitals and the community, SecuriCare offers a free home delivery service for prescription stoma and continence care products, as well as prescription medicines through their in-house pharmacy, PharmaCare. Now, invisible illnesses is a term that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, but how many of us have come across the word stoma or urinary incontinence? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. In this episode, we're joined by Bob Smith, and we're going to have a chat all about his experience of living with a stoma. Around 13,500 people undergo stoma surgery each year in the UK, and did you know that it's estimated that 1 in 500 of us in this country are living with a stoma? Well, whether you are living with a stoma, know someone, or have a loved one who has a stoma, or just fancy learning more, keep on listening.
Invisible Illnesses, Stoma and Continence series, brought to you by SecuriCare.
I'm Bob Johnson, and this is the third episode in our mini-series, Invisible Illnesses, Stoma and Incontinence. And today I'm joined on the phone by Bob Smith. Bob, welcome. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
I'm 55. I live down in what we like to call sunny Bournemouth. I'm married, 12 years now, and I work for a private healthcare company as a compliance auditor.
And you are also somebody who has a colostomy. So tell us about that and how you adjusted to life with a stoma.
So I've had my colostomy now for nearly 18 months. Previous to that, the reason I have it is because I had very bad infection from diverticulitis, which is something that people generally over 50 have, but it doesn't normally cause too many problems, but in my case it did. And after numerous operations and losing part of my bowels, I've got a colostomy, which I named Fred, just to make life easier for myself. So, that was 18 months ago. We have tried a reversal once already, but unfortunately that wasn't successful. And several more operations later, I'm hoping still to have it reversed next year, but if not, it will be made permanent for me.
Before you had it, did you have any knowledge, any idea of people with a colostomy?
None at all. I didn't know anybody with one. Well, I say that, in actual fact, there was 2 people in my family who had them. But it was a little bit of a taboo subject. One person in the family, one of my nephews actually, I didn't even know had one. He had one just for a few months. And the other person is one of my sisters, but because it was a sister, it was all a bit of a taboo subject to talk about, so it wasn't really discussed. And again, she only had hers for 3 months before it was reversed, and so it wasn't really discussed at all. So no, I didn't have any knowledge or experience of it.
So when you first of all had it, what were some of the things that you had to get used to?
The main thing to get used to is obviously it does change everything. You know, coming home from hospital and just realising that you've got to change your daily habits without going into huge personal details, as it were. But for me, it's every other day. That's what I find works for me. I've got a bag that I can drain, so if it does need putting out in between times, I can do that. But the initial coming home from hospital, learning how to do it, is quite a personal thing. I didn't really like anybody else doing it. And for me, it was sort of facing the fact that I now had this and learning how to manage my supplies, because there was always a dread that I might run out of something and be caught with no supplies, for example. What I found really helpful was to get into a routine with everything. So, as I say, I changed my bag on average every other day, having all the supplies in advance, having it all laid out so I knew exactly what I was doing was really helpful.
it must be very difficult to get used to and to accept the help that you need first of all, because as you say, it is something that is actually very, very personal.
Yes, and it's finding the right help. I am a member of several support groups, online and Facebook, places like that, which I found invaluable because although I've got an excellent consultant who looks after me and I've got a great team of stoma nurses at the hospital, that's more on the clinical side. For me, it was more I needed to figure out things on a home front. So, clothing and just dealing with situations that can occur at work and going to the pub and stuff like that. So it's really useful finding the right resources of people that I can actually just talk to who actually have it as well.
When you were out and about, did you worry about the bag and about that people might see or that they might notice?
Yes, very much so. One of the big issues for me, I've never had body image problems throughout my whole life, but very quickly I developed what's called a parastomal hernia, which can be quite common with people with stomas, and they are like a hernia but just a lot bigger. And I've had 3 of them now in the last 18 months. So it kind of gives you a huge bump on your belly, which is very difficult to hide. And initially I had a lot of issues where I would stand and get changed about 4 times in the morning trying to figure out what actually hid the bag the best. And because there's nothing worse than you're out and you can see people staring at your belly, because it is unusual. And like myself, people just don't know what it is that they're looking at. So it does create quite a mental issue for people, I think. It certainly did with me.
And also, I would imagine, because it's such a personal thing, the clothes that you wear and how you feel comfortable, it's not necessarily something that actually people can give you lots and lots of advice about, because it is actually down to how you feel yourself.
Exactly, and I think this is where having other ostomates, as we call each other, in support groups, where we can chat to each other and it starts building up your confidence in lots of different ways, both with clothing, with how you handle the stoma itself, when oddities happen with the stoma, and it's nice to be able to talk to somebody and they say to you, oh yes, I've had that as well. So you don't feel panicky or anything like that. And also in a work environment as well, is quite important to get your head round it, so that when people do come and approach you and ask you questions, that you're quite comfortable to be able to answer them as well.
Talking to other people, that again must be quite a big thing, particularly initially, to have that conversation.
Yes, because initially you've got to get your head round what's happened to you, and then being able to answer questions which, as I mentioned, it is a bit of a taboo subject at the end of the day. So keeping it quite light-hearted, that's why I named mine Fred, because I didn't quite know how to refer to it. Do I call it my bag, my stoma, my colostomy? And it was a friend of mine, and she said, will you please just give it a name, because then we all know how to refer to it. So I thought it was quite fun, and it does make it a bit of a lighter subject to broach people, for people to broach me about. And I do find that a bit of humour sometimes, especially for me, can make people a little bit more at ease asking me about it and the consequences and how it affects me daily.
I certainly can see as well that the fact that you've given it a name, yes, that makes it a lot easier for your friends then to know exactly how you want it referred to. I can also imagine some fairly comical situations where maybe you're with a friend and somebody who doesn't necessarily know about Fred, and you keep chatting about Fred and they wonder who on earth this Fred person is that you're referring to.
Absolutely. And it can be even more comical if we meet a bunch of friends and there's a Fred there, because that can get very confusing. But it's also it's come into its own. I try to live as normal as possible, and I do like going to the pub, and I do like going out. And sometimes I might need to get away, go, to sort things out, or even just to leave. And it's almost become a little bit of a code word as well. But, I just need to go and sort Fred out. It kind of, it deflects and makes it a little bit easier to talk about it.
When you do need to go and sort Fred out, is that something that you do yourself? Is that something that you ever need a partner's help with? Or is it something very personal that you're just comfortable dealing with yourself?
It's something that I always do myself. I've asked my path to do it once, and that was when I'd first come out of hospital and I wasn't feeling great. But what I found was I didn't actually like the way it had been done. And it's one of those things, because it is quite personal and because you've got to have so much faith and trust and confidence in the bag, that somebody else doing it is not the same as you doing it. It's kind of, I've got to know that that's going to stay on my belly and it's not going to leak and it's not going to come apart and there's not going to be any gaps in the seal. And only if I do that can I have that confidence. So it is something that I always do myself.
And with regards to finding the right product as well and the right bag, I'm assuming that that's a very personal thing, and what works for one person probably doesn't necessarily work for everyone.
Exactly. And I think it's very good that most companies now will send out samples. And I recently have tried various new bags because I've got another hernia. And so I was trying out different products just to see if I got a better fit. And in actual fact, I've reverted back to my original bags. But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't have tried them. And I think it's very much a sharing of knowledge between people who have the bags as to what works for them and what doesn't. And also just giving each other ideas of things to try as well.
Now, you've mentioned going to the pub a lot. Tell us about food and drink with a stoma and how that differs and how you have to adapt.
Sure. I think it's a very personal thing. I don't think there's been two people that I've spoken to on my journey with Fred that have had the same kind of experiences. I love my food and I love my drink as well. So it was very difficult at times having to not have certain foods and certain drinks. And so depending on the condition that you have, of course, that really affects what you can and can't eat and drink. For me, I see myself as quite fortunate because I've had the disease part of my bowel removed. It has opened up to me being able to eat pretty much anything and drink anything. There are consequences, though, because each part of your bowel actually does a different job. So once you start removing parts of it, it means that you can't digest everything as you would do normally. So, for example, the part that I've lost is one that absorbs a lot of liquids and salts and things like that. So I just have to make sure that I balance my diet a little bit more than normal. But also, it means that I have to keep a close eye on my output because it can go wrong. And if it goes one way or another, it can have quite bad effects on the bag as well, which can create problems if you're out, for example.
Are there times where you think, well, even though you know that actually, yes, it might create a small problem, are there certain things that you think, well, I'm going to have that today as a treat, it's not something that I'd normally have, and you then put up with the side effects?
Yes, absolutely. This is all part of the learning process, not only with the products, with your lifestyle, your own limitations, but also food and drink. So, for example, there'd be certain foods that are high in fat. I'm partial to the occasional kebab, for example, but I know the next day I will suffer the consequences because of the fat content. But it's where you weigh up the risks and you weigh up the consequences of your actions, and sometimes you need to treat yourself.
Absolutely. I think that's very important as well. One of the things that we hear a lot about these days now are invisible illnesses. Probably if we said that phrase 10, 15 years ago, people wouldn't have actually known what it is. But I assume it's a good thing that actually that's becoming much more mainstream these days.
It is, and I think people are becoming much more open to ask people about it as well. If you have a stoma, you can now apply for a blue badge, which is quite recent. That's only happened in the last year. But that's an acknowledgement that although it is fairly invisible in that sense, that there are needs of that person, for example, to be able to park near toilets or to be able to park near to facilities because they might need them very urgently. So I think it's opening up the debate with people, and I know I've had a lot of discussions with people who, it can vary, people's reaction to me, can really vary an awful lot. But once we've had a conversation and they realise that it's just one little bit of me and it doesn't define me in that sense, but I've had to learn to adapt to it.
I think also it's a lesson to us all, because when you see somebody with a blue badge, and particularly somebody, I'm assuming, you can walk absolutely fine, whether it's going to the toilet or whatever, but it is a very good lesson that actually just because somebody has a blue badge, there's a very stereotyped image, I think, that some people have of people with blue badges, and that certainly doesn't apply to everyone.
Absolutely, and I know that I've been guilty of that in the past as well. That you see a blue badge, you automatically assume a disability is somebody who's in a wheelchair, for example. And when you see somebody getting out of a car with a blue badge who's not in a wheelchair, it can, I think, be quite easy to make that judgment. But I think the more this sort of thing is discussed, the more people understand that there's more than one disability, and there's certainly more than one invisible disability. People are becoming a little bit more understanding of that kind of stuff.
If you could go back and, say, speak to yourself just before you had Fred, what advice would you give? What would you say?
Oh, that's a very tricky one. I was absolutely terrified going into my initial operations that I would end up with a stoma. And I remember almost begging my consultant to do everything possible because of the dread of having one, which was based on ignorance. So I think the advice I'd probably give myself pre-Fred is to have read up a little bit more so I wasn't so ignorant of it. And I think just to be a bit more knowledgeable and a bit more up-to-date on what it would actually mean to me if I did come out of the operation with one. So it wasn't such a terrifying thing to go into.
Bob, I want to thank you so much for your honesty. It's been absolutely fascinating meeting yourself and Fred as well. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
You're very welcome.
Invisible Illnesses, Stoma and Continence series, brought to you by SecuriCare. Whatever your stoma or continence care needs, SecuriCare puts you first.